David Walker had always prided himself on control. His life, carefully constructed brick by brick, was stable. A successful job in one of New York's top law firms, a beautiful wife, and a comfortable life in the city. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. But tonight, standing outside the dimly lit office building long after everyone else had gone home, he felt something dark stir within him. His hands trembled as he clutched the door handle to his boss's private office. The one place he thought he would never need to step into under such circumstances. Not like this. It had started weeks ago, subtle changes. Sarah, his wife of 10 years, had become distant. There were no fights, no obvious signs of trouble, but something about her had shifted. She was suddenly busy with late-night work meetings, texts went unanswered, and her eyes seemed to avoid his whenever they were together. David had tried to ignore it. He convinced himself it was just the stress of her job at the marketing firm, or maybe she needed some space. After all, 10 years of marriage had its share of ups and downs, didn't it? But then, there was that voice in the back of his mind, a cold whisper telling him something far worse was at play. And now, after weeks of gnawing doubt, it had all come crashing down. Tonight, everything changed. David hadn't meant to follow her. But when Sarah left the apartment unusually early, dressed in a way that sent a pang of suspicion through his chest, something inside him snapped. He had followed her, watched her disappear into the office building of his boss, Richard Hale, the man who had guided his career for nearly a decade, someone he trusted, someone he admired. The gut-wrenching truth hit him hard as he stood outside Richard's office door, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might give him away. Through the frosted glass panel, he could see shadows moving inside. His breath hitched in his throat as he heard Sarah's laugh, soft, intimate, familiar. But this time, it wasn't for him. Pushing open the door, David stepped inside, his world crashing down around him. What he saw tore at his very soul. Sarah stood with her back to him, her silhouette barely visible in the low light. But it was unmistakable. She was there, in Richard's arms, her head resting against his chest. The way she touched him, the way he cupped her face, leaning in close, made David's stomach turn. There was no mistaking the intimacy between them. The heat, the desire that once belonged to him was now shared between his wife and his boss. They hadn't noticed him yet. Too engrossed in each other, too lost in the passion that enveloped them like a dark cloud of betrayal. David couldn't breathe. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the scene playing out in front of him, by the raw, gut-wrenching betrayal of the two people he trusted most in the world. Sarah tilted her head, and Richard's lips brushed her neck. She moaned softly, the sound stabbing into David's heart like a knife. This was not just a meaningless affair. This was deeper, darker. A betrayal so profound that it shattered every piece of the life David thought he knew. His hands clenched into fists, his vision blurred with rage and disbelief. For a split second, he wanted to storm into the room, scream, shout, confront them with every ounce of fury boiling inside him. But he stopped himself. No, that wasn't how this was going to end. Not now. He backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears, and left the building without them ever knowing he had been there. The walk back to his apartment felt like an eternity. Every step echoed in the empty streets of Manhattan, but David was numb to the world around him. His mind raced, replaying the image of his wife in Richard's arms over and over again, like some twisted, cruel film loop. By the time he reached the apartment, his mind had shifted from the shock and pain to something far more dangerous, a plan. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wedding photo on the wall. Sarah smiling, radiant in her white dress, her eyes full of love. A love that now felt like a lie. David's anger was no longer a fiery outburst. It was cold, calculated. He wasn't going to confront them. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. No, he was going to destroy them. Slowly, methodically. He knew Richard's weakness. After working closely with him for years, David had learned the dirty secrets that his boss had kept hidden behind his polished, charismatic exterior. And Sarah? She would fall too. She had betrayed him, shattered his heart into a million pieces. She would pay for that. But he needed evidence. He needed something tangible, something that would not only ruin their lives but leave them with nothing. David began to gather everything he could. He hacked into Sarah's emails, combed through her phone records, and tracked down any evidence of their affair. What he found was far worse than he could have imagined. This wasn't a fling. It had been going on for months, maybe even a year. Richard had been grooming her, manipulating her. They weren't just cheating. They were planning something darker, something far more sinister. As David dug deeper, he uncovered a series of encrypted emails between Richard and Sarah. His stomach turned as he read the subject lines. Life insurance, accidental death clause, finalizing the plan. They were planning to kill him, to stage it as an accident and cash in on the life insurance. Sarah, his wife, the woman he had loved for so many years, was plotting to murder him with the help of his boss. David sat there in stunned silence, the weight of it all crushing down on him. But instead of despair, he felt a dark thrill rise in his chest. They thought they were clever. They thought they could outsmart him. But now he had the upper hand. This was no longer just about revenge for an affair. This was survival. This was about making them suffer for every lie, every betrayal, every moment they had conspired to take his life from him. David's heart pounded with a newfound clarity. The betrayal of Sarah and Richard had been soul-crushing, but now he had the ultimate weapon, their own sinister plan. They had wanted to destroy him, to erase him for profit. But now, he would destroy them first. That night, David couldn't sleep. His mind raced with strategies, piecing together every step he needed to take to bring them down. His rage had evolved into something colder, something far more dangerous. He wasn't going to lash out in a blind fury. No, he was going to orchestrate their downfall with precision. By morning, he had a clear vision of what needed to be done. The first step was gathering proof. The encrypted emails between Sarah and Richard were enough to get the police involved, but David wasn't going to stop there. He needed undeniable, visual evidence of their affair. Something that would not only crush them personally, but ruin Richard's career and Sarah's reputation for good. He knew Richard had secrets far beyond this affair. It was time to expose everything. David began by setting up a hidden camera in his boss's office. It was risky, but Richard trusted him, and David had access to the office after hours. He had planted the device in the corner of the room, where it would have the perfect view of any encounters between Richard and Sarah. Then, it was only a matter of waiting. For the next week, David lived on edge, pretending everything was normal. He went to work, sat through meetings, and even shared casual conversations with Richard, all while knowing that every moment brought him closer to the endgame. He watched as Sarah continued her facade, smiling at him over dinner, acting as though nothing had changed. But he saw through it all now. Her touches, once comforting, felt cold, calculated. And then it happened. It was a Thursday evening, and Sarah had told him she had another late meeting at the firm. David pretended to believe her, kissed her on the cheek, and watched her leave. He waited an hour before heading to Richard's office, his hands shaking with anticipation. When he arrived, the building was quiet, most of the staff having already gone home. David entered the office through the side door, where no one would see him, and made his way to Richard's door. He didn't need to open it this time. The hidden camera had been set to stream the footage directly to his phone. David sat down in an empty conference room nearby, his breath shallow as he watched the live feed. Sarah was already there, seated on Richard's desk, her legs crossed, her skirt hitched slightly up her thigh. Richard stood in front of her, his hand on her knee, whispering something David couldn't hear. Sarah smiled that same smile she had once given him, but now it felt like poison. David's grip tightened on his phone as he watched the scene unfold. Their touches became more intimate, more frantic. Richard pulled Sarah closer, their lips meeting in a passionate kiss. The rage that had simmered inside David for weeks exploded into a cold, focused fury. He wanted to scream, to burst into the room and tear them apart, but he didn't. Not yet. He recorded everything, every kiss, every whispered word, every touch. It wasn't just an affair. It was proof. Proof of their deceit. Proof that would tear apart their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. By the time the two of them had finished, David had more than enough footage. He watched as Sarah adjusted her clothes, brushing her hair back, while Richard casually zipped up his pants. They shared a brief, satisfied smile before Sarah left, leaving Richard alone in his office. David's hands trembled, but he forced himself to remain calm. Now it was time for the next phase. The next morning, David went to work as usual. He greeted Richard with a nod, suppressing the urge to punch him in the face. The image of Richard with Sarah was burned into his mind, but David maintained his composure. He had a plan, and he was going to see it through. His first move was subtle. David sent an anonymous email to the firm's board of directors, attaching the footage of Richard and Sarah's affair. The subject line was simple: "Your VP's secret life." The email didn't just contain the damning video. It also included details about Richard's financial misconduct. Over the years, David had uncovered small discrepancies in the firm's accounts, transactions that didn't add up. He had always kept quiet about it, but now it was the perfect leverage. Once the email was sent, there was no turning back. Within hours, the firm was buzzing with whispers. David could see the tension in the air as the higher-ups were called into meetings behind closed doors. Richard was pulled into a conference room later that day, his face pale as he passed by David's desk. He didn't know yet who had betrayed him, but David could see the panic setting in. By the end of the day, word had spread. Richard was suspended pending an investigation. It was only the beginning, but it was enough to make David feel a sense of satisfaction. His boss's career, the one he had built over decades, was crumbling before his eyes. The firm had no tolerance for scandal, and Richard's affair with a colleague's wife was about to become public knowledge. But David wasn't finished. Next, he turned his attention to Sarah. She wasn't at work when the fallout began, but David knew it wouldn't be long before she heard about Richard's suspension. He prepared for what was coming, knowing she would soon be desperate. Sure enough, that evening, Sarah came home early, her face flushed with worry. "David," she began, her voice shaky. "Something happened at work today. Richard, he's in trouble. They're saying all kinds of things about him, about us." David stared at her, his face expressionless. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. "Us?" he repeated coldly. "What exactly are they saying, Sarah?" Her eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to know. "David, I didn't mean for this to happen," she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "It was a mistake. A horrible mistake." David felt a surge of anger, but he kept it controlled. He had seen enough. He had felt the weight of her betrayal for too long. "Stop," he said sharply, cutting her off. "I know everything, Sarah. I know about you and Richard. I know about the emails. I know about the plan." Her face went white as the words sank in. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The truth was out in the open, and there was no escaping it now. David stood up, walking slowly toward her. "You were going to kill me, Sarah. You and Richard. For money." Sarah shook her head frantically, her tears spilling over. No, it wasn't like that. I never wanted to hurt you. It was Richard's idea. He said it was the only way." David laughed bitterly. "The only way to do what? To get rid of me?" Sarah collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. David watched her, his emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. Part of him wanted to comfort her, to forgive her. But the other part, the part that had been twisted by the betrayal and the lies, wanted her to feel every ounce of pain she had caused him. David watched as Sarah broke down, her sobs echoing in the silence of the apartment. He felt no pity, no sympathy. The woman he had once loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who had plotted to end his life. Her tears felt hollow, like everything else she had said in the past months. It was all a charade. "David, please," Sarah's voice cracked between her sobs. "It was never supposed to go this far. I didn't know what else to do." David stood over her, his hands clenched into fists. The rage that had once threatened to explode was now a cold, controlled force. He had the power now. She was vulnerable, exposed, and he wasn't going to let her manipulate him with her tears. Wasn't supposed to go this far? David's voice was low, dangerous. "You were going to kill me, Sarah. You and Richard. What part of that was a mistake?" Her sobs grew louder, her face buried in her hands. I wasn't thinking. Richard. He said it would solve everything. The money, the stress, everything would be fixed. I just wanted things to be better. Better? David's voice rose, filled with disgust. Better for who? For you? So you could run off with my money and my boss? So you could start a new life while I lay dead in the ground? Sarah shook her head frantically, but her words were a garbled mess of apologies and excuses. It was clear that she had no real defense, no way to justify what she had done. She had betrayed him in every way possible, and now she was faced with the consequences. David couldn't bear to look at her anymore. He turned away, his mind racing. The next step of his plan had already been set in motion. Sarah didn't know it yet, but everything she had hidden, every dirty secret, was about to come crashing down. He walked into the bedroom, leaving her sobbing in the living room. Inside, he retrieved the hard drive where he had stored all the evidence he had collected. The emails, the video footage, the financial records. It was all there. Everything he needed to destroy her life, just as she had planned to destroy his. David took a deep breath as he prepared to send the final pieces of evidence. He had already sent the video of the affair to Richard's boss. Now, it was Sarah's turn. She had more to lose than just her marriage. David had discovered that she had been embezzling money from her company for over a year, hiding the funds in secret accounts she thought he'd never find. It was all ready. He had carefully crafted an anonymous message to Sarah's boss, detailing her embezzlement and attaching the incriminating documents. With one click, he could send it all. His finger hovered over the send button. And then, for the first time in weeks, David hesitated. He had imagined this moment so many times. The moment when he would finally pull the trigger on his revenge. When he would destroy Sarah the way she had tried to destroy him. But now, standing on the edge of it, something inside him wavered. Would it make him feel better? Would this really give him the closure he had been craving? His mind flashed back to all the moments they had shared. The good years, before everything had fallen apart. The laughter, the love, the life they had built together. Was there any part of that still left, buried beneath the lies and betrayal? David clenched his jaw, shaking the thoughts away. No, Sarah had made her choice. She had chosen to betray him, to conspire with Richard to end his life. There was no going back from that. She deserved to lose everything, just as she had tried to take everything from him. With a cold, steady hand, David pressed send. The fallout came faster than David had anticipated. Within hours, Sarah's boss had received the anonymous tip, and an internal investigation was launched. David could only imagine the look on Sarah's face when she got the call, when she realized that her entire career, everything she had worked for, was collapsing around her. Richard's situation wasn't any better. The board had uncovered the extent of his financial misconduct, thanks to David's carefully planted evidence. His suspension turned into a formal termination, and soon after, the firm released a statement to the press about his dismissal for ethical violations. The media picked up on the scandal, and Richard's name was dragged through the mud. David watched it all unfold from the safety of his apartment, his phone buzzing constantly with news updates and messages from mutual friends who had heard about the affair. He ignored them all, content to watch as their lives unraveled. Sarah came home late that evening, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She didn't say a word as she walked into the apartment, her movements slow and robotic. She looked like a woman who had lost everything, because she had. David didn't offer her any comfort. He didn't ask what had happened at work. He didn't need to. He had orchestrated it all. Instead, he watched her as she sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she poured herself a glass of water. The silence between them was suffocating, but David didn't care. He felt a twisted sense of satisfaction watching her fall apart. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "David, what happens now?" David didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, studying her, weighing his options. What had happened now? He had already ruined Richard's career, and Sarah's would soon follow. He had everything he needed to destroy them both completely. But what was left for him? The satisfaction of revenge had been fleeting. The anger, the bitterness, it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But the emptiness? That hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown. "I don't know, Sarah," he said finally, his voice colder than he intended. "I really don't." Sarah looked at him, her eyes pleading, searching for some sign of forgiveness. But David had none to give. Not anymore. The weeks that followed were a blur. Sarah's company quickly uncovered the full extent of her embezzlement, and charges were pressed against her. She was forced to resign in disgrace, her reputation in ruins. Richard's life was no better. Without his position at the firm, he lost his status, his income, and the connections he had built over decades. His name was blacklisted from every major company in the city. David had succeeded in his plan. He had destroyed them both. But as he sat in the empty apartment, the silence around him deafening, he realized that it hadn't brought him the peace he had hoped for. The revenge, the destruction, it hadn't filled the void inside him. If anything, it had made it deeper. He had won, but at what cost? The marriage he had once cherished was gone, shattered beyond repair. The woman he had loved had become a stranger. And now, as he looked at the wreckage of the life they had built together, David realized that he was just as lost as he had been before. The anger had given him purpose, but now that it was gone, he was left with nothing but the hollow echoes of what could have been. One evening, as the sun set over the city, David packed a small bag and left the apartment for the last time. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay. Not here. Not in the place where every corner held a memory of the life he had once had, and the betrayal that had torn it apart. As he walked through the streets of Manhattan, the city buzzing with life around him, David felt an odd sense of relief. His old life was gone, burned to the ground by lies and deceit. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something new to rise from the ashes.